Welcome to a story of duty, strength, and resilience. Follow Marcus Fields, a royal guard at Buckingham Palace, as he faces not only the weight of tradition, but the harsh realities of prejudice. In a single moment, everything he's worked for is tested. This is more than just a tale of military discipline. It's a journey of standing firm in the face of adversity. Join us as we dive into a gripping narrative where honor meets provocation and integrity becomes the ultimate weapon. For 6 years, Sergeant Marcus Fields had stood as a symbol of discipline and tradition, a black royal guard serving at Buckingham Palace. To some, his post was merely ceremonial, an antiquated relic of British history. But to Marcus, it was far more than that. It was an honor, a calling, and a testament to the resilience of his journey. Every thread of his meticulously pressed uniform told a story of perseverance. The polished buttons gleamed under the sunlight, reflecting his pride, while the iconic bearskin hat sat squarely on his head, a reminder of the generations of soldiers who had come before him. The morning was unusually warm for London, the summer heat pressing down like an invisible weight. The sun shone unrelenting, and the air carried a faint buzz of excitement from the crowd gathered behind the wrought iron gates. Marcus stood at attention, unyielding, a statuesque figure amidst the sweltering heat and throng of eager tourists. Beads of sweat rolled slowly down his temple, but he didn't move to wipe them away. Movement was not an option. Stillness was the essence of his duty. His position required more than physical endurance. It demanded unwavering focus and emotional restraint. Marcus had trained for years to embody the stoicism that the role required, learning to master not just his posture, but his thoughts. He had practiced ignoring distractions of all kinds. Children screaming for attention, flashes of cameras, even the occasional absurd request from a tourist to make him laugh. This ability to remain composed was a skill honed through rigorous training and years of enduring challenges, some of which had nothing to do with his role as a guard. Marcus had faced skepticism when he first joined the Royal Guards. As one of the few black soldiers in such a visible role, he had felt the weight of both expectations and prejudice. There were whispers among his peers during training, murmurs questioning his ability to handle the demands of the post. But Marcus had silenced them all, not with words, but with actions. He had proven himself over and over, surpassing expectations and earning the respect of even the harshest critics. As the changing of the guard ceremony began, Marcus focused his thoughts on the rhythm of the occasion. The sharp clinking of boots against stone echoed through the courtyard as his fellow guards moved in perfect unison. The regimented sound was like a heartbeat, steady and commanding, resonating with centuries of tradition. Each movement was deliberate, each step an extension of history itself. From his vantage point, Marcus could see the crowd beyond the gates, their faces alight with anticipation. Tourists jostled for the best view, cameras raised high to capture the iconic moment. Among them were families with young children perched on shoulders, couples sharing whispered admiration, and individuals soaking in the grandeur of the scene. For many, this was a once-in-a-lifetime experience, a glimpse into the pomp and ceremony that defined British royalty. Despite the pride he felt in being part of this legacy, Marcus couldn't help but feel the weight of his presence. His role, while prestigious, often made him a target of scrutiny. He had learned to spot the subtle shifts in expressions, a raised eyebrow, a lingering stare, signs that some questioned why a black man stood among the ranks of a centuries-old tradition. But Marcus carried himself with dignity, his gaze fixed forward, his posture unyielding. He was more than their doubts, more than their prejudices. As the heat intensified and the ceremony unfolded, Marcus's mind wandered briefly to the journey that had brought him here. He thought of his mother, who had worked tirelessly to ensure he had every opportunity to succeed, and his grandfather, a military man himself, whose stories of service had inspired him to enlist. Their sacrifices fueled his determination, reminding him that his presence in this role was not just for himself, but for them, for everyone who had paved the way for him to stand where he stood. The sound of the brass band swelled, pulling Marcus back to the present. The melody was both regal and commanding, a perfect accompaniment to the disciplined movements of the guards. As the ceremony progressed, Marcus remained steadfast, the embodiment of resolve and tradition. He was not just a guard, he was a sentinel of history, a living testament to the evolution of the monarchy and the resilience of those who served it. And so, under the scorching sun and the scrutinizing eyes of the crowd, Sergeant Marcus Field stood tall. To the world, he was merely a royal guard, another faceless figure in a grand ceremony. But within himself, he carried the pride of his heritage, the strength of his convictions, and the unshakable resolve to honor the duty he had sworn to uphold. The changing of the guard ceremony moved forward with the precision and elegance that had become synonymous with Buckingham Palace. The courtyard echoed with the rhythmic cadence of boots striking the stone, each step measured and deliberate. The royal band played a flawless rendition of ceremonial marches, their brass instruments gleaming under the midday sun. The music swelled, a rich tapestry of sound that evoked a deep sense of pride and nostalgia among the spectators. For many, it was a reminder of the unbroken thread of history that the monarchy represented. Tourists pressed themselves against the black iron gates, their cameras and phones held high to capture every moment of the event. The crowd buzzed with murmurs of awe, an orchestra of whispers in multiple languages. Children perched on their parents' shoulders pointed excitedly, their wide eyes filled with wonder at the sight of the guards in their resplendent uniforms. The bearskin hats, the crimson tunics, the polished black boots. It was a spectacle that demanded attention, a ceremony perfected through centuries of tradition. Yet amidst the grandeur, Sergeant Marcus Fields remained immovable, a pillar of discipline and composure. Standing at attention in the sweltering heat, his gaze remained fixed, unyielding. His body was a study in stillness, a sharp contrast to the lively crowd beyond the gates. He could feel the sweat collecting at the base of his neck, trickling down beneath his uniform, but he did not flinch. Every fiber of his being was dedicated to the role, to upholding the solemn dignity expected of the royal guards. From his peripheral vision, Marcus could see the subtle choreography unfolding among his fellow guards. Each motion was a testament to countless hours of training and unspoken trust. The guards moved as one, their rifles glinting as they shifted positions with military precision. Not a single step was out of place, not a single hand faltered. The synchronization was mesmerizing, a display of discipline that reflected centuries of regimental pride. The band transitioned seamlessly into a new piece, the triumphant melody swelling across the courtyard. The tune was unmistakable, one of the monarchy's most iconic marches. The sound seemed to lift the spirits of the crowd, drawing an audible wave of gasps and murmured appreciation. Marcus noted the subtle shift in the atmosphere. This was the crescendo of the ceremony, the moment when tradition and spectacle reached their zenith. Even as the crowd leaned closer, their collective excitement palpable, Marcus's mind stayed focused on his duty. It was not just a performance for him. The ceremony symbolized something much deeper, a commitment to a legacy that spanned centuries. Each movement, each note of the music carried the weight of history. And as one of the few black men to wear the uniform, Marcus knew he carried an additional responsibility. His presence was more than ceremonial, it was symbolic. Still, he was not immune to the energy emanating from the spectators. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd without turning his head, catching glimpses of faces illuminated with joy and awe. A young boy waved a small Union Jack flag enthusiastically, his cheeks flushed with excitement. An older couple stood arm in arm, their expressions serene but reverent. There were tourists from every corner of the world, united in their fascination with the pomp and pageantry of the monarchy. But not every face held admiration. Marcus had learned to spot the occasional look of doubt or disapproval. It was subtle, a narrowing of the eyes, a fleeting glance that lingered too long on him compared to the other guards. These moments didn't sting as they once had. They fueled him. His mere presence on this historic stage was proof that tradition could evolve, that the barriers of the past could be broken. He stood not just for himself, but for others who aspired to carve their place in spaces where they had been told they didn't belong. As the ceremony reached its conclusion, the relief guards marched into position, their movements mirroring those they were replacing. The symmetry was almost hypnotic, a seamless exchange that left no room for error. The retiring guards prepared to exit, their roles complete for the day, but Marcus remained in position, his role far from over. The band played one final triumphant note, and the courtyard fell into a brief, expectant silence. Then, a smattering of applause broke out from the crowd, growing into a wave of appreciation. Marcus could hear the faint sound of clapping, but didn't acknowledge it. To break his stance would be to break the illusion, to shatter the image of impenetrable discipline that the guards were meant to project. The gates of Buckingham Palace stood tall and resolute behind him, a reminder of the institution he served. As the applause subsided and the ceremony began to wind down, Marcus remained as steadfast as ever. He was not just a participant in the tradition, he was a guardian of it. And in this role, he understood his place, not just as a royal guard, but as a symbol of resilience, progress, and unwavering dedication. The sun burned high overhead as the final moments of the ceremony unfolded. For the crowd, the changing of the guard was a fleeting spectacle, a memory to treasure. For Marcus, it was a living testament to his commitment, a duty he would continue to honor long after the tourists had dispersed and the courtyard had returned to silence. As the last notes of the band's final piece reverberated through the courtyard, Marcus remained as still as a statue. The changing of the guard ceremony, with its perfect synchronization and grand display, had reached its conclusion. The crowd's excitement slowly began to dissipate, yet the energy in the air still crackled. The tourists, many of whom had waited hours to witness the event, began to murmur amongst themselves as they shuffled out of the palace gates, some still capturing the last moments on their cameras. Marcus felt a subtle shift in the crowd as people began to relax, the tension of the ceremony easing. His posture, still stiff and perfect, held the same air of dignity and discipline, as if he were the living embodiment of Buckingham Palace itself, timeless, unyielding. Despite the familiar comfort of his role, a quiet unease began to creep over him. He was not new to the attention, but today something felt different. He sensed the crowd beginning to break into smaller pockets, the once uniform wave of people dispersing into disjointed conversations. He could hear the faint chatter of families, couples, and excited groups discussing the event. But amidst this, there was one voice that cut through the calm like a blade, sharp, mocking, and unmistakably aimed at him. "Hey, black man, can you smile for the camera?" The words rang out with casual cruelty. A woman's voice, high-pitched and condescending, echoed across the courtyard. For a split second, time seemed to slow, and Marcus felt the weight of the insult settle deep in his chest. The heat from the sun seemed to intensify as if it, too, had recognized the sting of her words. It was not the first time Marcus had heard such comments. He had grown used to the occasional glance, the quiet whispers, the mocking smile, but something about the tone of this one felt particularly venomous. He exhaled slowly, focusing on his breath. His training kicked in, as it always did in moments like this. Stay calm. Don't react. The more unflappable you are, the more it shows them that their words have no power. These were the lessons he had drilled into his mind over the years, the ones that had carried him through the harshest moments of his career. Every breath was a reminder that he was a royal guard, not just a man in uniform, and that he had a duty to represent something greater than himself. For a moment, he allowed his mind to retreat to the stillness he had cultivated. He was in control. But then the woman's voice came again, louder this time, her words laced with an audacity that made his heart tighten. "Come on, smile for me, black man. I want a photo of you, not just the royal palace." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, his muscles stiffen. He could feel his blood pressure rising, but he kept his stance firm. The woman's taunts weren't just about his role in the ceremony. They were a deliberate reminder of his difference. The color of his skin. His very existence as a black man in this space, this iconic institution that was meant to reflect the long and storied history of the British monarchy. He resisted the urge to turn his head, to seek out the source of the voice. But he didn't need to. He could already feel the woman's gaze fixed upon him, the challenge in her eyes as she waited for a reaction. She wasn't just seeking a smile. She was waiting for him to break, to respond in some way that would prove her superiority. She wanted him to acknowledge her insult. But Marcus would not give her that satisfaction. His years of training were not just about standing at attention or following orders. They were about control. Control over his emotions, his reactions, his sense of self. He was here to uphold a legacy, to embody discipline and duty, and no matter how hard she tried, he would not let her pull him from his purpose. But the taunting didn't stop. The woman, now growing frustrated by Marcus's silence, stepped closer to him. Her voice rang out again, now laced with more venom, desperate to provoke a response. "What's wrong, huh? Too good to talk to me?" She scoffed loudly, her words dripping with disdain. Marcus felt a brief surge of anger, but he quickly quelled it. His entire body felt tense, a coil of restrained emotion that he could not afford to let unwind. The heat of the summer sun bore down on him, his uniform growing uncomfortably hot against his skin, but he wouldn't budge. Not a step, not a word. "Are you scared?" the woman continued, her voice now shrill with mockery. "What, too embarrassed to smile for me, black man?" The words hit harder than he anticipated, not because they were new, but because of the persistence behind them. She wasn't going to let him off the hook. And yet Marcus remained resolute. His gaze never wavered, his posture unwavering. He was the picture of discipline, even as the world around him pressed in with its hostility. It felt like an eternity before the woman's taunts began to lose their force. She clearly expected some sort of reaction from him, anger, frustration, a crack in his armor. But Marcus's stillness became its own kind of resistance. His silence was louder than any words could be. The woman huffed in irritation and turned away, muttering under her breath. Her gaze shifted to the rest of the guards, perhaps in search of an easier target. But Marcus remained untouched, unmoved. When she finally walked away, Marcus let out the breath he had been holding. The insult still stung, but he had survived it, just as he had survived every other challenge that had come his way. This was his role, to be steadfast, to stand firm even when the world seemed to press against him. He didn't need to smile for anyone. His dignity, his strength were the only things that truly mattered. And that, he knew, was a far more powerful statement than any mockery could ever be. After the woman finally turned away, Marcus thought the moment was over, the brief storm of mockery having passed. But like the summer heat, the tension seemed to linger, oppressive and heavy. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him, but none more piercing than the woman who had tried, unsuccessfully, to provoke him. He could still hear her muttering under her breath, her frustration palpable. For a few moments, there was only the ambient noise of the crowd moving through the palace grounds, tourists chatting, cameras clicking, the distant calls of guides leading groups. But then, just as Marcus thought he might finally have some peace, the woman's voice rang out again, this time with more venom than before. "Who let you in, huh? You don't belong here. A black man as part of the royal guard? Ridiculous." Marcus's jaw clenched, but his eyes never left the horizon. His grip on his rifle tightened ever so slightly, but only to remind himself that his duty remained the most important thing in that moment. He would not give in to her. Not to her hatred, not to her ignorance. The woman's taunts grew louder with each passing second, and it became evident that she was making a scene, drawing the attention of nearby visitors. Her voice was filled with disdain, and her words were a deliberate attempt to undermine Marcus's dignity and his place in this space. "Look at this, everyone. A black man in the royal guard. How many people had to die to make this happen? What happened to the old days when only real Brits could wear the uniform?" She spat the words out like they were poison, each one calculated to wound, to belittle. A few of the tourists around her started to laugh. The sound, at first distant, grew nearer as others, too, found amusement in her unprovoked attack. Marcus could feel the ripple of laughter through the crowd, some of it aimed directly at him. His heart began to pound harder in his chest, but still, he remained motionless. His face was a mask of composure, his eyes focused straight ahead, and his stance as rigid as ever. But inside, the tension was building. The anger, the frustration, the humiliation, it all churned within him. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the urge to respond, to defend himself, to silence her and make her regret her words. But he fought it. This was his test, the trial of patience he had faced countless times in his life, and especially throughout his military career. The woman, sensing his silence, escalated her attacks. "Tell me, do you even understand English? Or is this just some act?" She grinned, as though the idea of him not speaking the language was some great joke. "Maybe you should go back to where you came from, before you embarrass the Queen and the rest of us." There was a dangerous edge to her voice now. It was clear that her words weren't just about insulting Marcus's ability as a guard, they were about questioning his very right to be there, to exist in this role, to be part of the legacy he had devoted himself to. The insinuation that he wasn't really British stung with a particular sharpness, but it wasn't just an attack on his nationality. It was an attack on his identity as a man, as a person. Marcus felt the weight of the crowd's gaze upon him, and though most of them had turned back to their sightseeing, he couldn't escape the feeling that some of them were watching him, waiting for a reaction. He wondered if any of them could see the battle raging inside him, the war between restraint and instinct, between the need to uphold his honor and the overwhelming desire to shut her down once and for all. Her voice grew louder still. "I bet you're just standing there because they told you to? Huh? You can't even perform your duties properly. You think you're better than everyone else?" The laughter from the crowd grew in volume, now spilling out of a few more people who had gathered around the woman, amused by the spectacle she was creating. Some of them even mocked him in unison, echoing her words with crude imitations of his stance. The ridicule was palpable. Each laugh felt like a hammer striking his dignity, each mocking gesture aimed at breaking him. But Marcus refused to let them see how deeply the words cut. He refused to let them see how deeply they hurt him, how much they made him question everything he had fought for. The sacrifices, the years of training, the respect he had earned. This was his duty. This was his legacy. The woman finally seemed to tire of her insults, but not before taking one last jab. "You're not even worth the uniform. You should take it off and go home." As her voice trailed off, Marcus stood still, his body rigid with the strength of someone who had learned to endure, to silence the noise and focus only on his mission. But inside, there was a flicker of something, an ember of frustration that he struggled to extinguish. His mind briefly wandered to his parents, who had sacrificed so much to give him the opportunities he had. To his fellow soldiers, who had earned their place by proving their worth, by facing challenges head-on. To every black man and woman who had fought to create a space for themselves in this world, despite the odds stacked against them. The laughter slowly died down, and the woman moved on, her victory in her mind and in the eyes of those around her. But for Marcus, the damage was already done. It wasn't just about this one woman or her taunts. It was the deep, systemic prejudice that lay behind every insult, every sneer, every questioning glance. It was the part of the world that would never see him as truly part of it, no matter how many duties he performed, no matter how many traditions he upheld. As the crowd began to thin, Marcus's shoulders finally relaxed, but the frustration still gnawed at him. He had held his ground, physically and mentally, but there was a part of him that couldn't shake the sting of those words. He was still a royal guard. He was still standing tall. But for a moment, he wondered if he would ever be able to fully silence the noise of the world around him. The woman's taunts became more frantic, each word escalating in venom as she circled him like a predator sensing weakness. Her voice cracked with derision as she mocked his every movement, scrutinizing his stance and his role with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Her words were no longer just insults. They were deliberate attacks on everything he had worked for, everything he stood for. "Do you even know what it means to protect the Queen?" she sneered, pacing back and forth in front of him. "Do you think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing but a servant, a puppet." Marcus felt the heat in his chest rise again, the familiar sting of his emotions threatening to break free. But he forced himself to breathe. He had been trained to withstand provocation, to ignore the noise, to keep his focus. He had endured far worse during his years in the service, and he was determined not to let this woman, the source of his frustration and anger, break him. But the crowd around them was growing. More people had gathered, some drawn in by the spectacle, others simply caught up in the drama of the moment. A few murmurs of approval rippled through the onlookers as the woman turned her gaze back on Marcus, her smile widening. She could feel the crowd's attention, the pressure building with every word she spoke. "You're pathetic," she continued, her voice rising with each syllable. "This is supposed to be a prestigious role, but look at you. You're nothing. You don't deserve to wear that uniform." As her insults became louder, Marcus's heart hammered in his chest. He felt the overwhelming urge to shout, to make her understand how wrong she was. But he kept his mouth shut, the silence deafening in its intensity. Yet, the longer he stood there, the more it felt like his resolve was crumbling beneath the weight of her relentless abuse. And then, in a moment that felt like everything stopped, the woman raised her hand. Marcus barely had time to process her movement before her palm made contact with his face. The slap was sharp, unforgiving, and as it landed, the sharp sting of it echoed in his mind. For a heartbeat, everything went still. The world around him, the bustling tourists, the band playing in the distance, the murmurs of the crowd, disappeared. All that existed was the woman's smirk and the searing heat on his cheek. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. In all his years of enduring taunts, of maintaining his composure in the face of ignorance, he had never been struck. Not like this. His mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. He could feel his face burning, not just from the impact, but from the sheer insult of it. He had been reduced to nothing more than a target for someone's cruel entertainment. For the first time since he joined the Royal Guard, something inside him snapped. His training, everything he had ever learned about discipline and control, was no longer enough to contain the fury that surged through his veins. The woman stood there, laughing, waiting for Marcus's reaction, expecting him to crumble, to falter, to show the weakness she had been desperately trying to provoke. But Marcus didn't move. He stood tall, every inch of him rigid with the force of his restraint. His chest heaved with each breath, his mind racing, but his feet remained planted firmly on the ground. The slap was a clear violation, an act of blatant disrespect, but Marcus was not going to give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. For a moment, the thought of retaliating, of letting his anger erupt, of showing her just how deeply she had wounded him, was tempting. But then he remembered everything he had stood for. His duty was bigger than this one moment. The crown, the uniform, the history behind it. He was part of something much larger than the petty cruelty of a single person. Yet, even as he told himself this, the sting of the slap, the weight of her words, burned in his mind. He could feel the blood rushing to his head, the heat of humiliation pooling in his chest. She had hit him in front of everyone. It wasn't just an attack on him. It was an attack on his very identity, his honor, his place in this world. The laughter from the crowd still lingered in the air, but Marcus did not flinch. He did not allow his gaze to drop. He refused to let her see the impact of her actions. Instead, he locked eyes with her, his expression as unyielding as the stone walls of Buckingham Palace behind him. The woman seemed to take this as some kind of victory. Her smirk widened, and she turned to her friends, whispering loudly enough for him to hear. I knew he'd never react. They never do, just a puppet doing what he's told. Her words stung worse than the slap. It wasn't just her that thought this way. It was the whole system, the entrenched prejudice, the ignorance that permeated every corner of society. The idea that he, as a black man, didn't belong in this uniform, in this role, in this institution. That, in her eyes, and in the eyes of so many others, he was still nothing more than a servant. But despite the fury and humiliation welling up inside him, Marcus kept his composure. He kept his shoulders squared, his face impassive, and his stance firm. It was the only way to preserve his dignity, to hold on to his pride. As the woman walked away, her laughter echoing behind her, Marcus stood there, trembling not from physical pain, but from the weight of everything that had been unleashed in that moment. He had been slapped, he had been humiliated, but he was still here, still standing tall, still the Royal Guard. And that was something that no insult, no matter how sharp, could ever take away. The woman's smirk faded instantly, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty as she took in Marcus's unyielding stance. Her eyes darted from his face to his rigid posture, the powerful silence between them thickening. For a brief moment, the playful taunt that had once rolled off her tongue seemed to vanish, swallowed by the weight of the situation. She had struck him, physically, emotionally, and now, as the reality of what she had done began to settle in, she looked almost afraid. Marcus stood unmoved, his gaze locked on her with an intensity that could freeze time. His body was taut, every muscle straining to remain still, but the internal storm of emotions raged beneath his calm exterior. Anger pulsed through him, fierce and hot, but it was tempered by a sense of control. Years of training and discipline flooding his mind, reminding him that this moment was about much more than a slap. He had to remind himself that this was no longer just about him. This was about the respect he deserved as a person, as a soldier, and as a symbol of something larger than his own individual existence. The way she had treated him wasn't just an affront to his pride. It was an attack on the values he had dedicated his life to uphold. His grip on his rifle tightened slightly, the polished surface cold against his palm, grounding him in the moment. The weapon was not just a symbol of power. It was a reminder of his commitment to remain calm, even in the face of provocation. His thoughts swirled in a quiet frenzy, the harshness of her words and the slap still stinging in his mind. He had never been forced to confront this level of disrespect before, certainly not while standing at attention as a royal guard. The crowd, once filled with laughter and hushed whispers, seemed to hold its breath. A few people had begun to stir, their attention shifting from the woman to Marcus, sensing the tension that had shifted in the air. They watched, some with curiosity, others with an air of disbelief. But for the woman, her initial arrogance was now replaced with hesitation. She had pushed him, and though he had not broken, she now faced a reality she had never anticipated, the realization that her cruelty, her entitlement, had caused something far deeper than just a brief exchange of words. Her hand instinctively went to her mouth, as if she could retract the slap, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and she could no longer hide behind her smugness. In that instant, she saw Marcus not as a target of her ridicule, but as someone who was not to be trifled with, someone who would not be silenced, no matter how hard she tried. But Marcus did not flinch. His eyes never wavered. The woman's uncertainty became palpable as she scanned his face, trying to decipher his next move. What had she expected? That he would cower? That he would crumble beneath the weight of her words? That was the kind of response she had seen time and time again from others who were too afraid to stand their ground. But not Marcus. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, until the woman finally took a step back, her bravado cracking in the face of his unwavering stillness. She glanced nervously at the crowd, realizing the attention now focused squarely on her. The onlookers who had once seemed entertained by her mockery now stared at her with expressions ranging from disbelief to quiet judgment. Marcus's chest tightened, but he kept his composure, his face a mask of resolve. Inside, the storm was raging. The fear that had gripped him in the past, the fear of not being enough, of not being seen as equal, now felt distant. In its place, something solid, something unshakable, took root. He had done what he was trained to do: remain calm, maintain order, and not let the actions of one woman unravel everything he had worked for. The woman's breath came faster now, the realization of her misstep dawning on her as the attention of the crowd shifted once more to her. Her voice, which had once been dripping with confidence, faltered as she muttered a half-hearted apology. I didn't mean. Marcus said nothing. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes, louder than any words she could offer. There was no need to engage further. The slap had been delivered, and her attempt to undermine him had failed. In a way, it was almost like the universe had stepped in and forced her to face the consequences of her actions. The woman's face turned red with embarrassment. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes meeting the faces of those around her, and saw the judgment in their eyes. The crowd, once eager to watch the drama unfold, now seemed to recoil from her. A few people muttered among themselves, shaking their heads. Her self-assuredness was crumbling, piece by piece. And Marcus? He was still there, standing tall and resolute, his presence commanding the respect that had once been called into question. The weight of history, of tradition, and of his own inner strength anchored him in place. For a brief moment, as the woman stood there, floundering in the wake of her own mistake, Marcus's mind flickered back to his earlier thoughts. This was the culmination of everything he had endured. Every racist comment, every subtle glance of judgment, every time he had been asked if he belonged. This was his moment to prove, not just to her, but to everyone watching, that he was not to be dismissed. In the end, the woman turned and walked away, her arrogance deflated, her confidence shattered. She could not break him. Marcus stood there for a moment longer, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He felt the eyes of the crowd upon him, but his pride, his dignity remained intact. He had not allowed her to strip that away. As the changing of the guard ceremony continued around him, Marcus held his head high, every inch the man he had always been. The aftershock of the slap, the humiliation, the fury, it had all been part of the battle. But in that moment, he was unbowed. The tension that had gripped the air since the slap lingered, thick and palpable, as the crowd began to murmur among themselves. Some had stepped back, visibly uncomfortable with the exchange, while others still watched, eyes flickering between Marcus and the woman. But it was a security officer, stationed nearby, who finally noticed the growing unease and the atmosphere beginning to sour. His instincts kicked in, and he immediately made his way toward the scene, his hand resting on the radio clipped to his belt, ready to call for backup if needed. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his voice firm yet calm. "You need to step away from the guard. Your behavior is inappropriate and unacceptable." The woman turned toward him, her expression not one of fear or guilt, but defiance. Her chest puffed up as she squared her shoulders, ready to face this new adversary with the same scorn she had directed at Marcus. "What are you going to do about it?" she sneered, her voice dripping with disdain. "He's just standing there, being a statue. Why shouldn't I say something?" The officer's face remained impassive. "You're not here to mock or provoke the guards, ma'am. They are part of a respected tradition, and they're here to uphold the dignity of this ceremony. Your actions..." He paused, glancing at Marcus, who remained steadfast in his position. "Your actions were completely disrespectful and inappropriate." The crowd around them was becoming increasingly tense, the murmurs of disapproval growing louder, but the woman seemed unmoved by the officer's words. Instead, she folded her arms across her chest, a tight smirk curling on her lips. "Respect? Ha! I'm not going to be lectured by some security guard about respect. This whole thing is just a show, anyway. They're not real soldiers." The officer's gaze hardened. He stepped closer to her, now standing between the woman and Marcus, blocking her view of the royal guard. "This show, as you put it, is about far more than just pomp and circumstance. These men and women are here to represent the values of our nation, the history that has shaped us, and the very spirit of respect that you seem to have forgotten." For a moment, the woman wavered. The crowd was now watching her closely, that their once casual glances now filled with judgment and disappointment. The officer's words seemed to have struck a chord, but the woman refused to back down. Her eyes narrowed as she shot him a venomous look. "I don't care about your history or your respect," she snapped. "You can't tell me what to do. I'll say what I want, when I want, and no one can stop me." But the officer wasn't backing down either. His voice remained unwavering, calm but resolute. "I'm asking you to leave, now." He gestured to the side. "If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to escort you out." For the first time since her confrontation with Marcus, the woman seemed to falter. She glanced at the officer, then back at Marcus, her gaze lingering on him a little longer than before. The defiance that had characterized her earlier reactions seemed to waver in the face of the mounting disapproval from both the crowd and the security presence. The officer's stance was clear. He wasn't going to let this continue. And if she resisted, there would be consequences. The woman's posture was now rigid, but there was no longer the same air of arrogance that had once surrounded her. "I don't need to listen to this," she muttered, her tone less confident than before. Her eyes darted around, catching the gaze of several onlookers who had been watching the exchange with growing unease. The officer's presence had made it clear that her actions had crossed a line, and now, in the quiet aftermath, she was suddenly aware of the weight of the crowd's disapproval. With a final, frustrated huff, she shoved past the officer and stormed away, her shoes clicking sharply against the cobblestones. The officer watched her go, his hand still resting on his radio, ready to report the incident if necessary. The crowd seemed to release a collective breath, some people nodding to one another, while others muttered in quiet conversation, their eyes still on Marcus. The tension in the air didn't dissipate completely, but it was clear that the woman's presence had lost its power. Marcus remained as still as he had been the entire time, his face as unreadable as it had been before the confrontation. He wasn't bothered by the woman's departure. Her insults had already been dealt with, both by his own inner strength and by the officer's timely intervention. But the reality of the moment settled in. He had been tested, both in the line of duty and as a man. And though the incident had shaken him, his resolve remained unbroken. As the officer turned to walk away, he offered Marcus a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of the Royal Guard's dignity and strength. Marcus didn't return the gesture. His gaze remained forward, unwavering, as he took in the scene around him. The changing of the guard ceremony continued, unperturbed, as tourists milled about, snapping pictures, and children pointed in awe. But to Marcus, the moment held far more weight. It was a quiet victory, not over the woman who had provoked him, but over the injustice that had sought to diminish him. He stood tall, not just as a guard, but as a man who had faced a moment of cruelty with unshakable dignity. And in that, he had proven something much more important than the ceremony itself, that his strength, his presence, and his sense of self could never be erased. The tension in the air had not yet fully dissipated. Though the woman had walked away, leaving behind a trail of indignation and a whispering crowd, her attitude remained defiant. She wasn't done yet. As Marcus continued to stand firm, stoic in his duty, the woman's bitter words carried on, now aimed at anyone within earshot who dared to disagree with her views on the ceremony. She argued loudly that the guards were nothing more than props in a grand spectacle, mere symbols of outdated traditions and an embarrassing display of British pomp. Her words clung to the air like smoke, but Marcus chose not to respond. His training had prepared him for far worse than insults. After all, standing guard meant maintaining control, no matter how harsh the world around him might seem. The ceremony continued as planned, with the familiar rhythms of the changing of the guard offering a sense of order amidst the chaos of human behavior. However, the woman's son, Noah, a young boy of no more than 5 or 6, had been standing next to her, holding a small plastic toy soldier in his hand. In his playful innocence, Noah's grip slipped and the soldier fell from his hand, landing on the other side of the low iron fence that separated the public from the restricted area where Marcus stood. The toy clattered to the ground, the sound sharp and momentarily out of place in the otherwise orderly scene. Noah's eyes widened in distress as he gazed down at the fallen toy, his small hand reaching out, desperate to retrieve it. "Mummy! My soldier!" he cried out, his voice tinged with genuine concern. The woman, already irritated and clearly looking for an opportunity to undermine the event further, saw her chance. She looked at the toy, then back at the guard, and in that instant, her decision was made. Ignoring the rules, ignoring the warning glances from other tourists, and ignoring the quiet murmurs of disapproval from those around her, she stepped toward the iron fence. "Don't worry, Noah. I'll get it," she muttered under her breath, already lifting her leg to climb over. The crowd gasped in unison. It was an act so brazen that even Marcus, who had remained unmoved by everything up until that point, couldn't help but feel a sharp stir of frustration. It wasn't just the woman's disrespect towards him now. It was the blatant disregard for the rules, the disrespect for the very institution that she had so openly mocked. But more than that, it was the dangerous precedent she was setting for her son. The woman was halfway over the fence now, her hands gripping the cold metal bars, her legs dangling in midair. She ignored the concerned voices of onlookers, focused entirely on her goal, retrieving a small, insignificant toy soldier. It wasn't just reckless, it was defiant. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the rifle in his hands. The line had been crossed, and the woman's actions had now moved from inappropriate to dangerous. "Ma'am," he called, his voice strong, though calm. He had no intention of escalating the situation, but there was a firm warning in his tone. "You cannot be here. Please step down." The woman barely heard him, or perhaps she simply didn't care. "Just a second," she muttered, swinging her leg over the last of the fence, her foot landing with a soft thud on the other side. She took a few steps forward, clearly more concerned about her son's toy than the consequences of her actions. But as she bent down to retrieve the plastic soldier, Marcus's patience reached its limit. This was no longer a matter of simple disrespect. It was an infringement on the rules that governed the safety of the entire area and the sanctity of the ceremony. He stepped forward, his boots clicking with precision against the stone ground, a deliberate movement that made everyone around him freeze. "Ma'am, "You are trespassing on restricted grounds," Marcus stated firmly, his voice unwavering. "You need to return to the public area immediately." The woman, now fully kneeling on the ground, looked up at him with a mixture of annoyance and defiance. "I'm just getting a toy, for God's sake," she snapped, as if that made everything better. She did not move, her eyes locked with his, unyielding. Marcus's stare didn't waver. He was used to confrontation, but this was different. This wasn't an insult. This was an active defiance of authority, of tradition, and of the very respect that had been instilled in him through years of training. With a deep breath, Marcus took another step closer, the crowd falling silent in anticipation. His presence loomed larger than ever before, a reminder of the power of order and discipline. "I'll give you one more chance to return to the other side of the fence," he said, his voice colder now, every word sharpened with authority. The woman hesitated, then scoffed. "You can't tell me what to do," she muttered under her breath. "I'm not going anywhere." But Marcus was unyielding. His hand moved toward his radio, a signal to his colleagues nearby to assess the situation. The woman's defiance was slowly starting to unravel, her bravado faltering under the watchful eyes of the royal guard. The crowd, which had once been filled with murmurs of judgment, now watched in stunned silence, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Noah, still standing outside the restricted area, looked on with wide eyes, uncertain about what was happening. His toy soldier, once the focus of his innocent world, now seemed insignificant in the face of a much larger confrontation. The woman slowly stood, clutching the toy soldier in her hand, her posture not one of victory, but of reluctant compliance. "Fine," she said bitterly. "I'm going. But you can't make me respect anything here." Her words echoed in the silence that followed as she climbed back over the fence, her son trailing behind her. The crowd, once anxious and unsettled, now relaxed, though the atmosphere remained heavy. Marcus stood tall, his posture unchanged, watching them leave. His gaze didn't follow the woman as she walked away, but remained fixed ahead, a silent guardian of tradition, of respect, and of the unspoken laws that held the fragile balance of the moment. The air around Marcus seemed to grow heavier with each step the woman took toward him. Her defiant stride was unmistakable, a calculated challenge to the authority he represented. Her expression, once smug and self-assured, had now twisted into a mixture of contempt and irritation. It was as though she believed she could push past any obstacle, and that the rules, the traditions, and even the guard standing before her were all beneath her. But Marcus knew better than to let that belief take root in his mind. His pulse quickened, though his stance remained unyielding, his every movement measured. He was prepared for this, trained for these moments of confrontation, where respect for the institution and for tradition hung by the thinnest of threads. As she crossed the line, coming dangerously close to the boundary of the restricted area, his voice cut through the tense silence like a sharp blade. "Ma'am, I've asked you to return to the public area. Please stop where you are." The words were calm, but the authority behind them was undeniable. The woman stopped, her eyes narrowing, as if she hadn't expected him to challenge her so directly. For a moment, there was only the soft rustling of the crowd around them, a low murmur that quickly grew into whispers of concern. The tourists, who had been witnessing the spectacle from a distance, now turned their attention fully to the unfolding drama. Some watched in curiosity, while others seemed to feel the weight of the tension, understanding that they were witnessing a rare breach of decorum, one that could escalate at any moment. She was within arm's reach now, her defiance palpable, her face flushed with irritation. "I'm not going anywhere," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "I'm just getting a toy. It's harmless." Marcus, ever calm, did not flinch. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. You have been told to leave. Please comply." His voice didn't waver, but his body language was taut, a coiled spring ready to act should things take a turn for the worse. His grip on the rifle tightened, though it remained in its proper place, an unspoken symbol of the order he was sworn to uphold. The woman's lips twisted into a sneer. "You think you're better than me? Just because you wear that uniform, you think you can tell me what to do?" She spat, her words sharp and biting. The crowd began to murmur louder now, some voicing their disapproval at her behavior, others seemingly shocked at the audacity of her words. Before Marcus could respond, The woman took another step forward, her body language now an open challenge. She had crossed the line in more ways than one, disregarding not just the rules, but the very authority he represented. But just as the situation began to feel like it was on the verge of spiraling out of control, a new voice broke through the tension. "Step away from the guard, ma'am," a commanding voice said. Captain Harris, the senior officer overseeing the ceremony, arrived at the scene. His presence was instantly felt, a calming force that swept over the crowd. With years of experience, Harris had handled far more volatile situations than this, and his reputation for de-escalating conflicts was well known. His eyes swept across the situation, immediately understanding the gravity of what was happening. The woman, seeing the new authority in the form of Captain Harris, faltered slightly, but her defiance was not so easily quelled. She turned to face him, her anger flaring anew. "You're all just the same. I'm not doing anything wrong. I was just trying to get my son's toy." Captain Harris remained composed, his expression stern, but not without a hint of sympathy. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "the rules are clear. This is a restricted area. You are not allowed to cross it. You've been asked repeatedly to leave, and now I'm asking you again. Please step away." There was no malice in his voice, but his words were firm, each syllable weighted with authority. The woman's face flushed a deeper shade of red as she tried to stand her ground. "You don't get it. This is all just a game for you, isn't it? You just want to show off your uniform and your power." Captain Harris's eyes softened just slightly, but his tone remained unyielding. "I'm not here to show off anything. I'm here to ensure the safety and respect of this ceremony for everyone. Your actions are disrupting that. Please, ma'am, it's time to go." For a moment, it seemed as though the woman might refuse once more, that her pride and stubbornness would push her to test even Captain Harris's resolve. But the crowd, once murmuring, now stood silent, watching her every move. The weight of the moment hung in the air like an impending storm. The woman's gaze flicked to the onlookers, her bravado slowly beginning to unravel as the full impact of her actions sank in. She had been seen, not as a person standing her ground, but as someone who had overstepped, someone whose disregard for tradition had cost her any sympathy from the people around her. With a final bitter glance at Marcus and Captain Harris, the woman muttered a curse under her breath and turned away. She took a step backward, slowly, as though every movement pained her. Her son, still holding the toy soldier in his hand, hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to follow. But the woman reached out, taking his hand, and they began to walk toward the gate. Marcus stood still, watching them go. His gaze never wavered, even as the crowd slowly returned to their previous positions, murmuring amongst themselves. The situation had been diffused, but the tension lingered in the air, like a residue of anger and frustration that hadn't yet been fully erased. As the woman and her son exited the restricted area, Captain Harris turned to Marcus, his expression softening slightly. "Well handled," he said quietly. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement, but his eyes never left the departing woman. "Thank you, sir." His voice was low, reflective, but his mind was already moving forward, processing the events that had just unfolded. In that moment, he understood that what he had just experienced was more than a mere confrontation. It was a reminder of the weight he carried as a royal guard. The uniform, the duty, the tradition, they all demanded respect, and he had stood firm in the face of disrespect. And though the situation had been resolved without physical confrontation, Marcus knew that the real battle was often fought not with force, but with dignity. And that, he realized, was a battle worth winning. The following day, Marcus found himself standing outside Captain Harris's office, his heart heavy with a mixture of apprehension and weariness. The incident from the day before weighed on his mind, replaying over and over. He had faced down a direct provocation, stood firm in the face of a public insult, and upheld his duty to the best of his ability. Yet, despite his restraint, despite his professionalism, he had been summoned for a meeting that could very well determine his future as a royal guard. When Captain Harris had called him into his office, Marcus could not shake the feeling that his career was at a precipice. He had followed his training, maintained his composure, but had the situation really been handled the way the guard expected? Had he made the right decision? Or had his moment of frustration, no matter how justified, compromised his position? The door to the captain's office swung open, and Marcus stepped inside. Captain Harris sat behind a large oak desk, his expression serious, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was weighing his words carefully. "Sit down, Sergeant," Harris said, his voice calm but firm. Marcus obeyed, lowering himself into the chair opposite the captain, his back straight, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. "I've reviewed the situation from yesterday, Marcus," Captain Harris began, folding his hands in front of him. "You're a professional, and I've seen how you've conducted yourself in the past. But I must say, I was disappointed in your response to that woman. It's your duty to represent the Guard with dignity and authority, regardless of the provocation. You're a symbol of the monarchy, of tradition. And in that moment, you failed to maintain that dignity." The words stung more than Marcus expected. He had prepared himself for a reprimand, but hearing the captain's disappointment felt like a blow to his very core. He had tried so hard, had given everything to his role. But now, sitting in front of his superior, he was made to feel as though he had let it all slip away in one heated moment. "I understand, sir," Marcus replied, his voice low, betraying none of the conflict brewing within him. "But I need to explain what happened. That woman, she wasn't just insulting me. She was undermining everything I stand for. It wasn't just a matter of disrespecting my role as a guard. She was mocking me for who I am, for my race, for my existence in that uniform. It wasn't about entertainment for her. It was an attack." Captain Harris raised a hand, silencing him, but not unkindly. "I'm not questioning your reasoning, Marcus. I know the burden you carry, the challenges you face as one of the few black guards. But what I need you to understand is that your duty, your mission, is not to engage with such provocations. It's to rise above them, to embody the strength of this institution in the face of it all." He paused, and Marcus could see the regret in the captain's eyes. "I know it's not easy, and I don't pretend to know how it feels. But we must maintain our composure, especially when we are tested in ways that no one else can fully understand." Marcus looked down, trying to gather his thoughts, to reconcile the internal struggle. He knew what the captain said was true. He had been taught that the uniform he wore represented more than just himself. It stood for centuries of tradition, of duty to the crown and to the people. But the truth was, the weight of that uniform sometimes felt unbearable, not because of the responsibilities it carried, but because of the prejudice and hate that came with it. The stares, the insults, the undercurrents of judgment that he could never escape. "I didn't lose control, sir," Marcus said, his voice steady now with a quiet resolve. "I stood firm. I didn't engage with her in the way she wanted. I didn't retaliate, but I couldn't let her go unchallenged. If I didn't say anything, if I didn't show her that I'm more than just a target for her insults, what would that say? What kind of example would that set?" Captain Harris was silent for a long time, his gaze unwavering. When he finally spoke, his tone softened. "You're right, Marcus. I've been too hard on you. I can't pretend to know the kind of pressure you face, not just as a guard, but as a black man in that position. But the fact remains, you are part of something larger than yourself. That uniform, that rifle, it's more than just fabric and metal. It represents the strength, the endurance, the dignity of this institution. And you represent that too, whether you like it or not." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he processed the captain's words, turning them over in his mind. He understood the point the captain was making, but he also knew that his responsibility went beyond just maintaining the dignity of the institution. It was about standing for something greater than tradition. It was about respect. Respect for himself, for the people who had fought to give him this opportunity, and for everyone who had ever been silenced or diminished by hate. "I get it, sir," Marcus said finally. "I understand the duty, and I'll keep that in mind going forward." Captain Harris nodded. "You've been a model soldier, Marcus, and while I can't condone what happened yesterday, I won't hold it against you. However, for now, I'm relieving you of duty for a few days. I want you to take this time to reflect. Think about how you can handle things differently in the future." Marcus felt a knot in his stomach as the words sank in. Relief from duty. It wasn't a punishment, but it felt like one. His heart sank at the thought of stepping away from his post. Yet deep down, he knew it was an opportunity to regroup, to find a way forward. "Understood, sir," Marcus replied, his voice resolute. As Marcus stood to leave, Captain Harris called after him. Marcus, I want you to know that I support you. You're one of the best we've got. This doesn't change that. It's a momentary setback, not a failure. Walking out of the office, Marcus felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The momentary relief of not having to wear the uniform for a few days didn't erase the struggle he'd faced, nor the challenges ahead. But it did give him the space to reflect, to reconsider what truly mattered. He had always known that standing up for what's right often came at a cost. But what mattered more than his uniform, his duty, or even his post, was his integrity, his values, his dignity. And no matter what the future held, Marcus was determined to carry them forward. In the end, he knew he had done the right thing. And in that, his dignity, his sense of self, remained intact. Even without the uniform, he would continue to stand for respect and equality. And that, he realized, was a fight worth winning. Days passed, and Marcus's time away from duty allowed him to reflect deeply. The streets of London, always bustling with life, seemed quieter as he walked without the weight of the uniform. In the stillness, he found clarity. The incident at the changing of the guard had been a test of his strength, his commitment to the values he held, and his belief in the respect that should be afforded to every person, regardless of their background or station. Though his absence from the palace had been brief, it had given Marcus the space to understand the true nature of his responsibility. His role as a royal guard was more than just a job. It was a calling. But what gave his calling meaning wasn't the uniform, nor the traditions he upheld. It was the unspoken commitment to dignity, respect, and the silent courage to challenge those who would seek to tear others down. On his return, the changing of the guard had the same pomp and ceremony, but for Marcus, it felt different. He stood tall, the sun glinting off his uniform, but there was something new in his heart, a deeper sense of purpose. He was not just standing for tradition. He was standing for all those who had been silenced by hate, by ignorance, by prejudice. He stood for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every black man and woman who had been told to shrink in the face of oppression. As the crowd gathered around the gates of Buckingham Palace, he glanced at the faces of the visitors, some admiring, some oblivious to the deeper significance of the ceremony. But in that moment, Marcus understood that his presence wasn't just about tradition. It was about breaking barriers, about standing firm, not just as a symbol of the monarchy, but as a symbol of strength and perseverance in the face of adversity. He had not lost his dignity the day the woman slapped him. No, in that moment, he had found it. He had found it in his silence, in his strength, and in the unwavering belief that the most powerful response to hate was not violence, but the quiet, resilient commitment to do what was right. As the ceremony ended and the guards marched back into position, Marcus felt a wave of pride wash over him. His duty had been tested, but he had passed. And in that test, he had found something more profound than any royal title or military honor. He had found his own legacy. The people might forget the faces of the guards who stood at attention that day, but Marcus knew that the real legacy wasn't in the uniform or the traditions. It was in the courage to stand, to endure, and to remind the world that respect, dignity, and equality were always worth fighting for. And that, in the end, was the greatest honor of all. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and the journey we've shared together, please take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share with your friends. Your support means the world to us, and we're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers. Every like, comment, and subscription brings us one step closer to our goal, and we couldn't do it without you. So if you believe in what we're creating, let's make it happen together. Hit that subscribe button now and be part of this growing community. Thank you again, and see you in the next video.